Prologue. This is a CNN breaking news commentary. Washington, D.C. Congress today passed the controversial gender reassignment bill, and the president is expected to sign it. Already the ACLU is planning to take this measure to the U.S. Supreme Court on the grounds that it is an unconstitutional violation of basic human rights. Proponents, however, said that it will drastically reduce the number of female impersonators committing crimes and then covering their tracks by resuming their male persona. The rash of such crimes has grown exponentially in the past few years, especially rape, and it has become difficult to apprehend the perpetrators. The ACLU said that it was a violation of the rights of innocent crossdressers to have to become a true female just because law enforcement cannot catch a criminal. Well, I can't speak for the rest of you folks, but if someone wants to look and dress like a girl, let him become one. The commentator remarked. A smirk on his face. Obviously a die-hard bigot. If the bill passes and is signed by the president, a new agency will be created called the National Gender Reassignment Agency. It will be that office's responsibility to manage the sex reassignment of anyone accused of cross-dressing. Such people will either have to agree to a 3-year program of psychological evaluation, hormone treatments, full-time real-life experience, and finally sex reassignment surgery. Before the last step is taken, however, the accused must be approved for the final step by a majority of the local GRA board. The accused can opt for withdrawal or be deemed unfit for the program, at which point the accused will be held for trial and, if convicted, will receive the mandatory 30 to 50-year prison term. Once a man had crossed over the gender line, any attempt on their part to live or dress again as men would result in permanent incarceration in a women's prison. For life. On June 14, 2036, the last of the class action court cases was turned down by the Supreme Court. The restraining order granted to the ACLU was lifted and the law went into effect. 3 years later, 1135 men and boys were officially and forcibly made members of the female gender as they underwent SRS surgery. Of that number, it was estimated that approximately 400 actually welcomed the government's free service. 353 others went to jail. Chapter 1. It was close to 1300 hours when I walked into the small federal office building in Greenwood, Arizona. Please take a seat, Miss Morton. You are a little early. I will call you when the board is ready, the receptionist said pleasantly. I sat in the anteroom waiting to be called in for my final interview. I cannot tell you how I feel except that I have one bad case of the butterflies. It was all down to this. Either I convinced the board that I was worthy of acceptance, or I would have to go back to where I started. And in jail to boot. 3 years of treatment and conditioning would be all for naught. I don't think I could bear to return to that conditions that had plagued me for most of my 22 years of life. For most people, this position I found myself in was a punishment. And as far as the law was concerned, it was supposed to be for me too. But I really looked forward to what I was about to become. I smoothed out the non-existent wrinkles from my dress for the umpteenth time. If this did not get underway soon, I was sure to have a nervous breakdown right here in the state gender assignment office. I don't think that would be looked upon favorable. Even though the agency staff was quite understanding, nervous conditions were looked upon with suspicion in 2040. I did not need the shadow of that hanging over my head right now. I suppose while I wait, I could tell you how I finally came to be in this place and why. It is a long story and filled with periods of denial and then finally awakening. I don't really know when it all started. Maybe from when I was really a very young tyke, although I don't have not a lot of memories of that time. I do remember those times vaguely. Bits and pieces of mother and I at the park or being tucked into bed at night. Little things that had no continuity. And, of course, the old photographs of a cute little girl and her mother. But, if any one incident had a direct impact on why and how I came to where I am now, it has probably started a year after I was adopted. Most likely little Mary Harrison was the instigator, but I cannot be sure. Maybe it was her sister Jamie or even my own sister. I don't really care at this point. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I remember my mother to some degree. But when an 8-year-old loses a parent, it is a traumatic experience, and the child tends to put up mental blocks to hide the hurt. I think in my case that was true. It was not until I was around 12 that my adoptive parents even told me anything about my real mother and how she had died. I could not comprehend the fact that I had been the product of a pregnancy born out of the result of my mother being raped. And then my mother finally dying from emotional disturbances. Complications that she had suffered because of that crime and the failure of the law to apprehend the perpetrator. She had never found closure, and this had finally overcome her. I don't know if finding out these facts had convinced me that being a boy and someday a man capable of doing the same thing was what moved me towards the feminine nature or not. Maybe it was the memories of being treated and dressed like a little girl by my mother when I was real young. Or maybe it was the influence and support that Nancy had on me. The psychiatrists that I had seen over those past few years had told me that was probably the former case. Especially the way my mom had influenced me when I was real young. But I still have my doubts. My choices were after all mine. Mom had never forced me to dress like a girl after I started school. That had been my choice, and only after I had been taken out of the orphanage and adopted. All Nancy had done was support my decision to be different. After all, she had said, a lot of boys do what you want to do anyway. I had my doubts about that though. My adoptive parents are Louise and Daniel Morton. Two of the sweetest people on this planet. Although, they are a bit old-fashioned. Real turn of the 20th century types, but I would not trade them for anyone else. By the way, my name is Sarah. I had taken that name in honor of my real mother. It was the least I could do in her memory. Besides, I liked the name. It was as close as you could get to my real one anyway. Miss Morton, Miss Morton. I opened my eyes as I was gently tapped on the shoulder. I'm sorry. I must have dozed off. I replied to the receptionist who stood beside my seat. That's okay. It has been a long wait. I was told to tell you that 2 of the board members are tied up on the metro. Apparently, some terrorist attack took out the tracks in Phoenix. As you know, in all fairness to you, all the members have to be in attendance for a decision to be made. If you prefer, you can come back tomorrow without any penalty to yourself. The girl stated with a look of compassion. Do I have to? Or can I just wait here for their arrival? I would like to get this over with once and for all. I replied. I'm sure a look of panic was on my face. Absolutely, dear. This is your choice, and the board is duty-bound to give you your review immediately upon their arrival since you were here on time for your appointment. I'll wait. I replied. Good girl. You will do fine. She stated with obvious compassion and a hint of support in her voice. I'll send out for some sandwiches and tea. It may be a long wait. I'll stay with you. I can't go home until the metro resume's running anyway. Thanks. I replied as the girl returned to her desk. I settled back into my recliner, kicked off my heels, and closed my eyes. I still remember the date, December 23rd, 2029. I had been told by Mrs. Jellison that my new parents, Mr. and Mrs. Morton, would be arriving that day to pick me up and take me to my new home. Once they signed the release papers, today will become your new birthday under the law. She had told me. Today I would celebrate my 9th birthday all over again, even though I had already done that in February. I had felt strange becoming almost a year younger with the stroke of a pen. I had not known it at the time, but Daniel Morton was 35 years old and his wife Louise was 30. To me they were old people, and although I had spent time with them the past few months and found them to be nice and I liked them, I was still apprehensive about living with them permanently. I had come to find the orphanage to be a secure and safe place, and I did not want to leave my friends. Especially Nancy. Nancy had become my very best friend. She was the same age as me, and we found we could relate to each other better than any of the other kids. I would sorely miss her, but I knew that it was only a matter of time and she would be adopted as well and we would be parted. It was the policy of the orphanage not to let the other children know that one of their own was being adopted until after the child had left. So it was not told to even the adoptee until the morning that they were to leave, and even then they were kept segregated. Thus was the situation I had found myself in. I was not allowed to say goodbye to anyone, even Nancy. Needless to say, I was totally surprised when on that morning Nancy was brought into the waiting room with me. She and I were totally overcome with delight when we found out that the Mortons were adopting us both. From that moment on, we both came to understand the caring nature and love that our new parents had for us, and we did everything we could to return that same love to them. Mrs. Jellison had made a point in getting Nancy and I dressed in the finest of clothing. I'm sure that she had been paid well to assure that we looked our best. Did I tell you that the Mortons were loaded? At the time I did not know much about that sort of thing, but in fact they were quite wealthy. Still, after what we had worn in the orphanage, Nancy and I felt quite besides ourselves. I in a fine suit and she in the prettiest dress I had ever seen. And there we sat, waiting to meet our new parents for the first time as their children, and Nancy and I about to become brother and sister. It was quite exciting, to say the least. When the door to the waiting room opened and Mrs. Jellison walked in with the Mortons, there we sat. Nancy and I holding hands with tears of happiness running down our faces. I will never forget how my new mom came running over to us and kneeling in front of us, she pulled us to her and hugged us and even cried with us. It was a moment I will never forget. The Mortons had arrived in their chauffeur-driven air car. I don't remember much of the ride to our new home. Nancy and I and our new parents sat in the back of the air car and talked for the whole trip. It was only as the car descended onto the lawn of the mansion did I pay any attention to what was outside the windows. The view of the white colonnaded house with its wide expanse of lawn and walkways was breathtaking. I had never seen anything so beautiful and wonderful. The mountains in the distance were covered in early winter snow. The late afternoon sun glistening off their peaks. An open expanse of forest stretched off across the valley and into the distance from behind the property. It's still holding on to a touch of late fall color. Nancy and I were totally overcome by the view. I'm sure that our new dad had noticed this on our faces because he had looked at us and then his wife. He then smiled and answered to our unspoken question. Yes, kids, this is your new home. Even to this day I still hold a special place in my heart for that beautiful place in the Susquehanna Valley. Chapter 2. We landed on the aircar pad and the livery driver got out and opened the hatch for us to exit. The butler and a houseboy, I didn't know what to make of them at the time, came out of the house and carried our luggage into the house. I was surprised that I even had any at the time. I later found out that our new parents had gone on an extensive shopping trip prior to picking us up. As we entered the house, I was shocked. I could not believe what I was seeing. I could not imagine anyone could live like this. I was nothing short of what I considered a palace. Nancy and I looked at each other, and I am sure we both had our mouths open in wonderment. If there ever was a fairy tale come true, this was it. We were taken on a tour of the house by the Mortons. I must say that each room and area we visited just made us even more overcome with wonder. Finally, we were taken up a wide circular stairway to the second floor and shown our rooms. Nancy and I had adjoining rooms with a connecting door. Locked, of course. Nancy's was the first we were shown. It was beautiful. The room looked out over the valley. The large bay windows with their arched top framed on each side by French doors that could open out onto the balcony over the front entranceway. The room was huge. To one side was the large white canopied bed that was covered in rose satin trimmed with pink lace. The windows and French doors covered with white lace curtains and framed with pink velvet drapes edged in white lace. The floor was covered in white plush carpeting. In one corner was a mirrored vanity, and around the room was various dressers and chairs. All in the Louis XIV style. A private bath was also accessible. It was in fact a room for a princess. I was immediately a little jealous. I didn't know why at the time. It would be another year before I even started to understand. Nancy was overcome. All she could do was hug Mother and start to cry. I did feel good that my sister was so happy. Next, I was shown my room. To say the least, I was a little disappointed. Not that it was not a great room. It was just a lot more plain and just a hint darker. The room had the same basic layout with the windows and French doors. The curtains were white like in Nancy's room, but the drapes were more of a dark blue heavy printed cotton. They were decorated with a myriad of small colonial American flags. The bed was a huge oak bed covered with a spread that matched the drapes. The dressers matched the bed in design, and the floor was covered in a blue/gray carpeting. The darker hues of the furnishings and decorations making the room much darker than Nancy's. I must say I was both pleased and disappointed at the same time. I soon, however, came to the conclusion that it was a lot better than anything I had ever had before, and that I ought to be grateful for my good fortune. We did not have time to dwell on our good fortune, however. It was already dark outside, and after a short time in the parlor watching TV, Mom told us that we would be dining in a few minutes and that we needed to get ready for bed. She told us that as a rule we would need to get dressed for the evening meal as we usually would have guests, but that tonight was special and that we could get into our night clothes and have dinner. Then it was straight off to bed. Nancy and I went to our rooms and changed. The maid had lain out my PJs on the bed, and in no time I was changed and walked out into the hallway. Nancy came out of her room wearing a white and pink nightgown and white fluffy slippers. She had put her long hair into a ponytail. She looked so pretty. I again felt a slight pang of jealousy, but just as quickly suppressed it. We sat at a large oak table. I would guess big enough for an army, but there were only 4 chairs all at one end. A candelabra was set at our end of the table. The 4 candles casting a warm glow over the place settings. Mom and Dad were already seated when we came into the room. They smiled at us as we took the places that Dad motioned us to. Dad sat at the end of the table and Mom on his right. We sat opposite Mom. Nancy next to Dad and me next to Nancy. For the next hour as our meal was served, Mom and Dad talked to us about our new home. They asked us questions about our former lives and were quite willing to let us talk about what we remembered. Then to our surprise, they brought out a birthday cake with 9 pink candles on one side and 9 blue ones on the other. It was our new birthday, and Mom and Dad told us that we were unique. We would be part of a rare few who would have a birthday and Christmas at the same time. It seemed like no time at all, and Nancy and I were off to bed. It had been quite a day. I don't remember hearing Nancy come into my room, but in the morning Mom found us cuddled together under the covers of my bed. Seems as though Nancy felt the need for some protection during the night. She simply told Mom that she had become scared and needed company. Mom never said a word. just nodded her head and shooed Nancy back to her room to get dressed. The next week was filled with new sights and sounds that I had never experienced before. This place was nothing like the drab old mill city of Lowell, Massachusetts, where I had been born and had spent the last 9 years of my life. I am sure that my new sister has overcome like I was. She just had a better way of containing her excitement. Where I would investigate anything that piqued my interest, especially the stable with its 6 beautiful Appaloosa horses, she would just stand close by and say nothing. Her interest in what I might be doing, however, gave her away. I was the boy, and it was normal for me to get my hands dirty while she, just like a girl, would not consider such a thing. Nancy was so much more refined. Even considering her background, which was much like my own, she seemed born for the life of a refined Southern girl. Our first year flew by. Nancy and I were enrolled in nearby Avon School. Avon was a private school that catered to the area's well-to-do. I can't say it was a bad place. It was, I suppose, similar to other private schools in that we were taught the basic skills that kids learn everywhere. The exception was that it was a strict school when it came to discipline. A student was instructed in the rules and you were expected to follow them. It was not uncommon to find a student sweeping the walkways or cleaning the windows as a punishment for some infraction. More than once I would hear, "Saul, I want to see you after class." That was a sure bet that I had screwed up and was going to have to pay the consequences for some minor infraction. Nancy and I grew ever closer during that year. Although she was technically the same age as myself, she seemed to be the one who seemed to become the most self-assured. She was not headstrong or anything like that. She just seemed to make the better judgments when we were deciding on some issue. She was the brains and I was the brawn, sort of speak. We only had one family close by with kids our own age. The Harrisons. They lived about a quarter-mile down the road from us. They had 2 children. Both girls. Jamie and Mary. Jamie was my age and her sister was a year younger. Needless to say, they made friends with Nancy quite easily, but for some reason they shied away from me. Not that they were unfriendly or anything like that. They just did not seem to want to associate with me unless Nancy was with me. There was times when the 3 girls would engage in some game where they needed the male figure, like playing house or doctor. I would be asked to play the male role. Other times they would play with their Barbie dolls or play dress up. At those times I was pretty much ignored or asked to get lost. During those times I would grab a book or watch TV, feigning disinterest. In actuality, I would watch them as closely as I could without them suspecting. At those times I would find myself getting jealous. I liked those games and really wanted to participate. I never said anything at those times, of course. Boys were not supposed to play with dolls or play dress up. Still, I wanted to, and I started to wonder if I had something wrong with me. I kept my peace, however. It was not until our second Christmas holiday that I was brave enough to find out what it was like to dress like a girl again, as I had once done a long time ago with my real mother. Of course, you guessed it. I got caught. At the time I was glad it was Nancy who had discovered me and not Dad or Mom. It was only later that I came to realize just how understanding my parents were. But Nancy, she took to the idea like a bird takes to air. I think it would have ended there if Nancy, in her enthusiasm, had not continued to press the idea. And of course Jamie and Mary became Nancy's co-conspirators when they found out. Mary, however, took a special interest in me after that. Anyway, let me back up a little. Christmas that year was on a Saturday. Mom had insisted that we help her get the house ready for the holidays. Christmas was a big event at our house. Lots of family and friends would visit, and Mom was a stickler for having everything clean and tidy beforehand. Nancy and I had been instructed to clean our rooms and put all our clothes that were dirty in the laundry room, and in everything else that needed to go to the cleaners we were to put on the rack in the upstairs foyer. Nancy was a neat freak, and it had not taken her long to complete the tasks. I, on the other hand, was somewhat of a clutter bug, and it took me a lot longer. Nancy, when she finished, stuck her head into my room while I was still rummaging through my closet. "See a slow poke. I am going over to the Harrisons. Come on over when and if you ever finish," she had said jokingly. "Okay. I'll be a while yet," I replied, but Nancy had already headed for the stairs. It was some time later before I decided that my room would pass inspection. I carried my dirty laundry down to the laundry room, and after returning for the suit that I needed to have cleaned for Christmas, I carried it down the hall to the foyer. I hung it up on the rack and noticed that Nancy must have put half her dresses on the rack along with her red velvet coat with the white fur trim on the rack. I was about to turn and head downstairs myself when I noticed one of Nancy's dresses that I had never seen her wear. It was a pretty white dress with pink lace accents on the collar and sleeves. At the waist was a large satin ribbon that tied in back with a large bow. The hem was edged with lace eyelet interwoven with pink ribbon. My curiosity got the better of me. I wondered what it was like to wear such a pretty garment. I listened for any sign of movement from downstairs. Hearing nothing except my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, I lifted the dress and the velvet coat off the rack. My hands trembled and my legs felt weak. I had never felt as strange or excited as I did at that moment. I knew what I had to do and hurriedly carried the dress and coat to my own room. I closed the door but forgot to lock it. That one omission, in retrospect, changed my life forever. The only thought in my mind at that moment was to experience what it was like to play dress up, even if I had to do it alone. I laid the dress and coat on bed, and I must have spent quite some time just looking at the clothing as I just totally lost track of time. Finally, I got up the courage to remove my shirt and pants and slip the dress over my head. I had fastened all the buttons on back of the dress except for the top 3 so that I had enough room to pull the dress on over my head. I was in ecstasy as the dress settled down over my body. It was so lovely. I reached behind my head and pulled my long hair over my shoulder so that I could fasten the 3 remaining buttons. As I did so, I observed my own reflection in the mirror across the room. It was then that I got a real shock. I looked not at all like a boy. All I saw was a pretty girl. 2, as a matter of fact. Nancy had opened my bedroom door and stood in the doorway. She was smiling broadly. I spun around and looked at her. Embarrassment was etched all over my face, I suppose, but Nancy said nothing of ridicule. Instead, she just stepped further into the room and closed the door. "I really think a little help from me might be in order here, sis," she said. The word sis was not lost on me, as I am sure I turned a few shades darker red than I was already. "You want to tell me about this Saul?" she asked, pointing to her dress that I was wearing. She asked the question with gentleness. There was no hint of ridicule in her voice. We sat for some time on the edge of my bed, and I poured out my heart to Nancy. It was strange. I told her how I felt. It was as if the dam had burst and I came face to face with my own inner self. I could feel the tears running down my face, and I did not care. Nancy said nothing. She just smiled and nodded her head, brushing an occasional tear from my cheeks. Finally, I got it all out. I turned sideways and buried my face in the covers of my bed and wept. I had finally shared my innermost feelings with another human being, and between the embarrassment and humiliation, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. When I finally stopped crying and sat up, I looked at Nancy and said, "I'm sorry. I should not have told you any of this. It is not your problem. Don't be silly, Saul. You're my brother and I love you. Who else could you tell except Mom and Dad? Do they know how you feel? No. No. I don't think they would understand, Nancy. I could never let them know about this. Don't be too sure, Saul. They might fool you. Anyway, we will keep your secret. We? Who is we? I asked. I could feel the bile rising in my throat. Jamie and Mary came up the stairs with me, and when they saw you in that dress they ran back down the stairs giggling. We are going to have to let them in on your feelings or else they will have it all over town. They are good friends, Saul. I know they will understand and keep your secret as well. I just nodded my head. I was stuck and had to trust Nancy's judgment. Good, now get changed back into your own clothes and come on over to the Harrisons. We all need to talk. Nancy said firmly. And Saul, the next time you want to dress up, please let me know. I really like my dresses and you need to learn how to put them on before you ruin them. She said jokingly. Oh, and pick a new name for when you dress up. Saul just doesn't cut it for someone in a dress. She said as an aside, giving me a kiss on the cheek and scampering out of the room before I could reply. The times that followed were wonderful. Jamie and Mary, after being told how I felt and why, became my two best friends next to Nancy. I was allowed to play in all their games and even was asked to come over to their house anytime I wanted. The only rule was that I was not allowed to play dress up unless we did it in Nancy's room. I think it really was because the girls were afraid I would get caught by Mr. or Mrs. Harrison. The girls were great teachers and I soon learned how to dress properly as a girl. It was amazing. I think Jamie and Mary had more fun fussing over me than Nancy did. Jamie had fun with the makeup and Mary was in heaven fussing over my long hair. It was Nancy that selected the clothes that I would wear. It was almost 10 years before I got caught again. In time, our little escapades as children tapered off. The Harrisons moved away. The girls had promised and kept their word. They never told another soul about me. I slowly entered puberty and developed into a normal teenage boy. Nancy developed into a beautiful young woman. We both graduated from high school at 17. Nancy decided she wanted to study law and become a lawyer. She applied and was accepted at Harvard Law School. I took a couple of years off after high school and finally, at Dad's insistence, entered the University of Arizona School of Business. Jamie and Mary both went off to college after graduation, but kept in touch with us by mail over the next year. It was Mary, however, who would write special letters to me personally, and I would occasionally get a teasing from Nancy about it. Good-naturedly, of course. It was because of Mary that I had decided to select the University of Arizona at Phoenix. Mary had enrolled there herself the year before. Of course, I did not tell Dad this. But Nancy found out somehow and sent me a postcard with one sentence. When is the wedding? Followed by her classical signature N and a little happy face logo. Chapter 3. Sarah, would you care for a sandwich and tea? The receptionist asked. I snapped out of my daydreams as I realized that I was being spoken to. I looked at the clock on the wall. I had been waiting for over an hour and a half. I looked at the girl standing beside the side table. Oh yes. Thank you. I am a little hungry. I replied. I think we have a few more minutes before your interview. The last of the board members just arrived and they have to do a short review before you go in. Are you okay with this? She asked. Some concern evident in her voice. Yes, I am, miss. I let the question go unfinished when I realized that I did not know the girl's name. Pamela. Pamela Britton. She replied to my obvious question. Nice to meet you, Pamela. Thank you for the sandwiches. I replied, taking the proffered plate and teacup. You're welcome, dear. She replied as she took her own plate and cup and sat down in the chair next to mine. She looked at me over the rim of her cup as she took a small sip of her tea. I could sense an unspoken question on her face. You're wondering how I am going to take this forced reassignment, I gather? I asked matter-of-factly. Well, yes. I am sorry, Ms. Morton. For a man you look so, well, feminine? I replied, answering her question. Well, yes. I guess so. You seemed so refined and comfortable. Not at all like most of the men who come in here. It is because this is what I want to do. Courtesy of the federal government, of course. I replied with smile. Really? I'm happy for you then. I hope everything works out for you, Sarah. I really do. Thank you, Pamela. I hope so too. I just have to convince them, pointing to the door of the hearing room, that I am ready for this and have met their expectations. Sarah, from what I see right now, you have an excellent chance of that. Just be yourself. Don't try to fool them or lie to them. They will know if you do. Pamela replied. Just then a tone sounded on Pamela's desk and she went over to answer the phone. Yes, ma'am. I'll send him right in. Pamela hung up the phone. You can go in now, Sarah. Good luck. Thanks, Pamela. I replied as I stood up and walked through the door to the hearing room. The relatively large room was austere to say the least. At the far end was 3 floor-to-ceiling arched windows. On each side in their appropriate places was the flags of the United States, its 56 stars lit up by a small light, and the state of Arizona. A long table with 4 chairs had been set to one side that allowed the light from the curtainless windows to fall down and across the table. A small table was set up with 1 chair about 10 feet in front of the long one. To one side was another table at which sat the hearing stenographer. On the other side of the room behind a long railing was a set of chairs aligned in rows. This was used for a gallery of interested parties and witnesses. On this day about 15 spectators sat in the chairs. Sarah noticed that there were 3 people in the gallery that she knew. One, his government-appointed psychologist, and the others were Nancy and Mary. They sat next to each other. Both gave her a smile and a little wave. On the wall behind the gallery was the large seal of the National Gender Reassignment Agency. Sarah walked confidently down the center of the room towards the small table. The sound of her heels on the hardwood floor belied the nervousness that she felt. She had been here before. 3 years earlier, when as Saul he had been told his punishment for violating the new prohibition on transvestitism. Now as Sarah he was to learn his final fate. It had been a long 3 years and he was not sure if he had passed the requirements for freedom or not. Sarah took her seat and waited. The government agencies had not changed much over the years. Wait. 10 minutes later the side door opened and the board members, 2 men and 2 women, came into the room. All in attendance stood until the board was seated. There was a shuffle of papers and then the older of the male board members opened the proceedings. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This session of the National Gender Reassignment Board for the Southwestern District is now in session. I am Kenneth Grayson, Associate Justice of the U.S. District Court. I will be chairing today's adjudication of this case for the National Gender Reassignment Board. Today's order of business is to make a final resolution to the case of the United States versus one Saul Morton. Exactly 3 years ago today, Mr. Morton was before this board accused of violating the cross-dressing prohibitions of the Gender Reassignment Act that became effective on June 14, 2036. Mr. Morton at that time had been found in his room at the University of Arizona by GRB agents dressed in the clothing of the opposite gender. Because of that incident, he was brought before this board and a hearing was held. The results of the hearing did in fact corroborate the accusations, and Mr. Morton was given the option of standing trial or voluntarily agreeing to joining the 3-year gender reassignment program. Mr. Morton agreed to enter the program, and we are here today to determine if Mr. Morton should be allowed to enter a government facility to complete the final gender reassignment surgery or be remanded for trial. Since Mr. Morton has completed the 3-year evaluation and has complied with requirements for mandatory hormone treatments and preliminary castration, and according to his psychologist Dr. Kent Roberts, who is present here today, successfully spent the last 3 years living full-time as a female and has selected and applied for a permanent name change to Sarah Ann Morton. We will proceed on the assumption that the petition of the accused for waiver of trial and completion of GRS should be granted. We will therefore refer to Mr. Morton as Sarah Ann Morton for the purposes of this hearing. Miss Morton, let me compliment you on complying so far with every aspect of the law. I hope you understand that if the petition is granted, you will forever be regarded as a member of the female gender. Even your birth and adoption records will be changed to reflect your new status. There will be no record that a Saul A. Morton ever existed. Even the orphanage where you resided as a child will only show that a girl by the name of Sarah Ann Jameson resided there and was adopted by a couple by the name Morton. Any attempt on your part to circumvent these conditions will land you in the federal prison for sexual deviates. Do you understand this? Yes, sir, was my only reply. What else could I say? Besides, I was quite happy with these conditions. Good. Then let's review your case. We have here the reports from Dr. Roberts as well as from the government clinic where you have received your treatments and counseling. I am quite satisfied with the reports, but I will defer any questioning to my colleagues. After a very short pause, one of the female members of the board addressed Sarah. Ms. Morton. I am Dr. Alice Grimes. I am chairperson of the U.S. Department of Genetics. I have read your statement as to your early childhood, but I am most interested in what happened after you got to the university. I understand you had not cross-dressed for nearly 10 years. What caused you to go back to that? Especially in light of the enactment of prohibition against such activity which you yourself admitted that you were well aware of? Sarah looked at the woman who asked the question. To Sarah, she seemed quite young for a person with such an impressive title and awesome powers. No more than 30 years old, Sarah thought. Doctor, it is quite a long story. I am not sure that I can get through it all today. Ms. Morton, you will spend a lot longer period of time behind bars if you lose this petition. We on the board are willing and duty-bound to hear you out. You go ahead. We will listen if it takes all night. After all, you did wait for us this afternoon, and that is a positive sign in and of itself. Thank you, Dr. Grimes. I will do my best to cover everything. Where would you like me to start? From the beginning, dear. From the beginning. She replied, Chapter 4, so I told them my story of the early years. Again. I arrived on the university campus in mid-August. Classes didn't start until the second week of September, and that gave me ample time to settle into my flat and start looking for a job. It wasn't really necessary, but Dad had insisted that I get a job. I suppose his logic was that if I had a job and had to pay for some of my own expenses, it would teach me some sense of responsibility. By the end of the first week, I had managed to lock down a part-time position with a local warehouse operating a fork truck. Not my ideal job, but it was at least a decent paying one for part-time, and I was pretty much on my own as long as I got the few trucks loaded before I went home. My friend Mary Harrison was not due to arrive on campus for 2 weeks, so I had nothing better to do than throw myself into my work. I guess this impressed my boss because by the time school started, Mr. Forrester, my supervisor, had given me a small raise and adjusted my schedule so that I could work almost full-time around my school schedule and still give me Saturday and Sunday nights off. This suited me just fine. Mary arrived on the Sunday before classes started. I picked her up at the bus depot and drove her over to her dorm hall. The girls' dorms were usually off limits to the boys, but the rule was suspended during moving days. After helping her get unpacked and everything put away, I took her on a tour of the campus. At least that portion that I knew. The bookstore, student union building, cafeteria, etc. The rest of the afternoon we just walked and chatted about everything that had happened since she and her sister had moved away. I found out that she was still living at home with her parents. They were living in the suburban town of Greenwood, Arizona, just an hour commute outside Phoenix. Her parents had agreed to let her live on campus provided that it was at U of A. This was so that they could keep an eye on her, so they said. It was great to have Mary close by. I must admit that I had become quite fond of her. I still am. Very much so. Sarah looked in the direction of the gallery where Nancy were seated. Mary returned a smile and a short wave at Sarah's statement. Except for a few hours on Saturday or Sunday nights, I did not see much of Mary the first couple of months or so. Between my schedule with work and school and her curfew at the dorms, that was about all we could manage. It was a couple of days before Halloween that we finally got together for a long weekend. Halloween was on a Saturday that year, and the school let out most of the classes until Monday in order to allow everyone to plan for the myriad of parties that usually took place on and off campus. Mary came up with the great idea that she stay at my flat for the weekend and we could plan out where we wanted to go for Halloween and as what. I took to the idea without hesitation. Of course, I had other ideas besides parties. I got out of work by 8 p.m. that Friday and went straight to my flat. Mary and I both loved pizza, and I really did not want to cook, so I called Domino's and ordered a couple to be delivered. Mary arrived about a half hour later. "Hi, lover boy," she said as I helped her with her burden. She was loaded down with packages. As always, even when she was dressed casually, she looked lovely. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of picking up some costumes for us for tomorrow. I thought we might make an appearance at the student union party tomorrow. Okay, Honorable, that sounds fine with me, I replied as I helped her put the packages on the sofa. What did you get for costumes? I asked, looking at the large boxes. No peeking, she said with a smile. You'll see tomorrow. But I hope you will like them. You won't believe this, but there is not a costume to be rented anywhere in town. I had to actually buy these from a theatrical supplier in order to get anything decent. But it was worth it. Now give me a kiss, she said, reaching up and locking her hands around my neck. I don't know how long we embraced, but it was only the knock on the door from the pizza delivery guy that had finally brought us back to reality. The rest of the night went by rapidly. We did all those things that lovers do, and it was late Saturday morning when we finally woke up. I was content to skip the Halloween party altogether and stay in the sack with my girl for the entire day. Were it not for Mary's insistence that we get up, have some breakfast and try on the costumes, I would probably done just that. Mary laid them out on the bed and made sure they were complete. They were the typical Alice in Wonderland costumes of fairy tale fame. The costumes were professional made and designed for the theater, so they were much better than what normally would be offered for Halloween use alone. I picked up the top hat of my Mad Hatter costume in preparation to trying it on for size. I felt a slight tap on the shoulder as Mary came up behind me. Not so fast, mister. That is mine. This one is yours." She was holding out the Alice dress to me, with a huge smile on her face. I felt my heart skip a few beats as I realized what Mary had in mind. She was to be Mad Hatter and I was to be Alice. I know it was only Halloween, but I had not dressed as a girl in so long that I was surprised at my own feelings at the thought of doing it again, even if it was nominally accepted practice for men to dress as females at Halloween. It was even legal under the new federal laws against cross-dressing. I had been very depressed when the law went into effect, and I knew that I would have to give up my affinity for dresses and such from then on. I was not going to go to jail just to do that, and I certainly was not contemplating a total sex change. It had never occurred to me that I could get around the law once a year by using the Halloween costume loophole or becoming an actor in some theater company. I felt excited at the thought of being able to dress again after so long, even if I had to do it in this fairy tale dress. Mary smiled at me. She was very astute and knew me better than anyone except probably for Nancy. Mary knew what was going through my mind but said nothing. She just waited for my response. I think my facial expression was all she needed, because the next moment she burst into a huge smile and came over and gave me a hug. She just whispered in my ear, "Okay, girlfriend, let's get dressed." Mary had not forgotten anything. My costume was beautiful. The Alice dress was yellow with a white apron in front. The white petticoats and white tights were a perfect complement to each other. Mary did my makeup that night, as I had lost the touch. But as was when Mary brought out the long brown wig and black patent leather Mary Janes, and I put them on, that I really felt like I was playing the little girl again. I looked in the mirror that evening and saw not Alice in Wonderland but just a pretty girl. The rest of that night went by like a blur. I was in heaven. I had not enjoyed myself that much since I was a kid and still at home. It was then that I decided that, law or no law, I was going to do what made me happy and damn the consequences. I would just have to be smart and not get caught. Of course, it did not work out that way. Chapter 5. Mom and Dad had sent me an email letting me know that they had invited the Harrisons to spend the Christmas holiday with us and that they had accepted. He asked if I would bring Mary along with me on the trip home. I was quite excited about this news, as was Mary. For the first time in over 2 years, we would all be together again. "Saul, did you get everything into the air car? It is almost time to leave." Mary called out from the bedroom. "Yes, I did. All except for your last suitcase," I replied. "How about the presents for our parents and for Nancy?" "God, Mary. I think I'll marry you. You're sounding an awful lot like a wife than a girlfriend," I called back jokingly. Mary stuck her head out from around the bedroom door. She wore her best inquisitive look. "Really?" she asked. "Really what?" I replied. "You want to marry me?" Well, it was out. It was not really the way I wanted to pop the question, but now I had to answer. I had to respond in a way that would not hurt Mary's feelings. I just stood and looked at her for what seemed like an eternity, but really was only a few seconds. In the end, I was at a loss for words. All I said was yes. Now understand, I'm not a very big guy. 5 feet 6 inches and 125 pounds soaking wet. I think that's why Mary and I were drawn to each other. She's only 5'1" and 100 pounds. But I will tell you this, when I said that simple yes to her question, she came and threw herself on me so fast that 100 pounds seemed like a bulldozer hit me. It was nearly an hour later that we finally pulled ourselves together enough to secure the apartment and start our drive back home for the Christmas holiday. We now had another surprise for our parents. It was to be an interesting 2 weeks. 5 hours later, the autopilot on our rented aircar gently set us down on one of the landing pads behind my father's house. We were that last to arrive. Mom and Dad and Mrs. Harrison were waiting for us on the back veranda as we walked up the walkway from the landing pad. Mary could not contain herself and ran up ahead of me and embraced her mother. As I came closer, Nancy and Jamie came out the back door, and before I knew it, the hugs and kisses from the women were all over me and each other. I shook hands with Dad, and then even he wrapped his arms around me and gave me a fatherly hug. I was surprised at that. He had never done that before. Nancy looked over at me and gave me a wink and then burst into a smile. I had the strange feeling that she was up to something. I felt all at once that I was really home. It was later that evening, as I sat on the veranda, that Nancy came out, gave me a sisterly kiss on the cheek, and sat on the swing next to me. It was the first time that she and I were alone together for over 2.5 years. We sat there for a couple of minutes, enjoying the mild December evening, not saying a word. It was Nancy who finally broke the quiet moment. I understand that congratulations are in order, she said matter-of-factly, just barely above a whisper. She looked straight out across the dark lawn. Mary told you? I asked, more a statement than a question. Yes, a little while ago. She said not to say anything as you guys want to surprise our folks on Christmas Eve. I saw you out here alone and just had to ask you if it was true. Yes, it is, Nan. We decided to wait until after Mary graduates in 2 years. We both agreed that it would be too much to try and set up a home with both of us still in school. Nancy turned and faced me. She reached out and put her slender arms around my neck, and I could see the tears in her eyes. She pulled me close and kissed me on the cheeks again. Saul, I am so happy for you both, I could just burst. Thanks, Nancy. I hoped that you would understand. I love you too, but I hope you understand that it as a sister and not anything more. I replied. Of course, silly. It has always been that way with me too. She looked at me strangely for a moment. I knew she was contemplating something else. What about Sarah? How does she fit into this? Does she even exist anymore? Nancy asked as she pulled away from me and looked at me quizzically. Yes, Nancy. For a brief few hours on Halloween she came back to life. Does Mary know? Yes. It was Mary who brought her back. She thought it was just Alice in Wonderland for a costume party, but I knew that it was Sarah and she was in Wonderland for a few hours. Is she coming back, Saul? I miss her. Nancy asked seriously. I don't know, Nancy. You know the new laws. If I ever got caught, it would be, well. I let that answer go unfinished. Nancy was about to reply when Mom called us to dinner. Nancy and I stared into each other's face for a moment, trying to understand where each of us was leading with the conversation, but saying nothing else. We went inside and went to dinner. That night, when I entered my old room to go to bed, I found a pretty pink and white rayon baby doll nightie draped across my bedspread. I suspected where it had come. Nancy, I was sure, was the culprit. I would have another talk with her in the morning. I laid the nightie on my dresser and put on my PJs and climbed into bed. I laid there for some time wishing that Mary was with me, but my folks had set one of the spare rooms for Mary and Jamie, and Mrs. Harrison was ensconced in the guest room. That night I dreamed of Sarah and Mary in bed together, wearing the same nighties and making mad passionate love. Chapter 6. It was the smell of bacon and coffee attacking my nostrils had awakened me. It was close to 9 a.m. when I finally walked into the breakfast room, still dressed in my PJs and bathrobe. Dad, Mrs. Harrison, Jamie and Mary were seated at the table having coffee, and Mom and Nancy were in the kitchen putting what I gathered was the finishing touches to breakfast. Everyone was dressed except for me. I felt a little self-conscious. Mom was the first to acknowledge my presence as I came through the doorway. "Good morning, dear. I hope you slept well. Would you like some coffee?" she asked in her always pleasant tone. I walked over and gave her a kiss on the cheek. "Thanks, Mom, I can use that," I replied, taking the pro-offered cup from her hand. "Hi, sis. Happy birthday." I had not forgotten that today was December 23rd and it was our official birthday. "Same to you, Saul," she said, giving me a hug. "Thank you for remembering. How could I forget? Jamie threatened me with dire consequences once if I ever did." "Remember? Oh yeah. That," she said with mock surprise. "I'm surprised you remember that." "Oh, I remember all right. Jamie and Mary were quite upset when I fell asleep and didn't come over to their house for that surprise 13th birthday party that they had planned. I didn't live that down for months." Nancy smiled and gave me a mock punch in the shoulder as we both remembered how I had had to don one of Jamie's party dresses each day for a week and serve the girls as a make-believe maid, or else I would not be allowed to play with them anymore. I never did forget her birthday again. I will admit that I enjoyed the dress-up part but hated having to be the maid. "Good morning, Saul. Happy birthday." "Hi, Dad." "Thanks." "Good morning, ladies," I said as I took the empty chair at the table next to Mary. "Happy birthday," the women said in unison. Dad looked over his glasses and smiled at us as Mary gave me a peck on the cheek as she said her greeting. Was all he said. I knew my dad and I was aware that he had something on his mind. I did not push it though. I knew that he would say what was on his mind when he was ready. I was nice to have everyone together again over morning breakfast. I had missed the family reverie that always accompanied the morning meal. Each of us would open up at that time in the relaxed and informal setting. We would always talk openly and candidly about anything that was on our mind. That morning was no different. It was just that I was totally unprepared for the topic, me, and the fact that it was my mother who started it all with her birthday present. After we had eaten and Mom had served coffee, she along with Jamie and Mary left the table only to return a few minutes later with an armload of presents and beautifully light birthday cake. Everyone immediately fell into singing the traditional happy birthday song to Nancy and myself. A few photo snapshots later and lots of birthday wrappings laying on the floor, Nancy and I were two happy people. Then the unexpected happened. Mom left the room only to return a few moments later with one more present. It was for me, and as I took it from her, everyone fell silent. No smiles. Just a look of expectation on everyone's face as I took the box. The box was nothing fancy, just a large flat gray box that most garments are packed in. Mom must have gotten me a new coat or something, I thought. But why the suspense? I slowly opened the box and got the biggest surprise of my life. Something totally unexpected. As I lifted the cover, inside laying on top of the tissue was a simple card. "Happy birthday, Sarah," from Mom, Dad, and the Harrisons. My hands trembled as I realized that my secret was out. I had no idea that Mom and Dad, or for that fact Mrs. Harrison, had any knowledge of my other quasi-identity. Mary and Nancy later told me that I turn almost pure white and then crimson when I read the card. As I looked under the tissue at the contents of the box, I saw the most beautiful satin burgundy dress that I had ever laid eyes on. The cream-colored lace on the bodice and edging the puffy half sleeves lay perfectly inside the box. My hands trembled so bad that I could not even move them enough to lift the garment out of the box. It was Nancy who quickly did it for me. She lifted the dress out of the box and held it up to herself. With a oohs and ahs, the girls, as girls always do over beautiful clothes, admired the dress. It even had an attached peekaboo petticoat trimmed with lace in the same color as the bodice. I have to admit that even I, in my humiliation of the moment, still found a strange fascination for the dress. I knew that no matter what happened in the next few minutes, I would have to try on that dress at some point. How did you know? How did you find out? I stammered after I regained my composure. I looked from face to face for an answer, but it was Mom and Mrs. Harrison who both burst out in smiles. Dad remained stoic and the girls just looked at me with a blank look of anticipation as to what I might do next. I am sure in retrospect that they held their breath for over a minute after I took the present in my hands. Saul, do you think that you could hide your desires and secrets from us? Do you not think that Mrs. Harrison would not know what you and the girls were doing those May times up in their rooms? We knew from almost the beginning what was going on. It is just that we felt that you, all of you, had to find your own identity. We watched and did not interfere as long as it was nothing more than dressing up. In time you seemed to grow out of that, and by the time the Harrisons moved away you seemed to forget all about Sarah. Seems as though I was somewhat wrong. Especially after Mary told me about Halloween. Mother looked at me with a smile. No hint of condemnation on her face or the others except for Mary, who turned a few shades of red. So what am I supposed to do with that? I asked, looking at the dress that Nancy was still holding, knowing full well what was on the minds of each of them. Dad, who had been quiet during the whole conversation, finally spoke up. I would think the ladies would like you to model it for them. I know I would like to see what my son looks like in a dress. His tone was not exactly harsh, but it did have an edge to it. Considering he knew of my earlier escapades and my long period of withdrawal from that activity, I think he was a little disappointed that I had gone back to it. Oh, hush up, Daddy. Let Saul make up his own mind. After all, Mom said that you knew all about this. Nancy said. Dad threw up his hands and headed towards the family room. Women. Now I may have one more to deal with, was all he said as he left the dining area. Although I put on an air of protest, I really was intrigued by the idea of dressing up again, this time as a real young lady and not as a child or for a costume party. I was somewhat aware that what I was contemplating was technically a violation of the new laws, but I figured that in the privacy of my own home I was safe from detection. So it was not more than an hour later I found myself staring in the bedroom mirror, looking at not myself, but a beautiful young woman, the results of the efforts and attentions of 3 women who were bent on using all their skills to transform me. Mary had even secretly brought the long human hair wig with her that I had used for the Alice costume at Halloween. It had been the finishing touch to my transformation. Mom, Dad, and Mrs. Harrison were, needless to say, quite surprised at the new girl that was introduced to them a short while later. Chapter 7. Miss Morton. Tell me, if you had known then that you were shortly to be discovered and arrested, would you have still taken the opportunity to dress as you did? Sarah looked up at Dr. Grimes as she asked the question. She paused for a few moments to formulate her reply. She had not been asked this question at any time by any of the multitude of examiners that she had been forced to consult with during the past 3 years. Dr. Grimes and the other members of the board all looked at her, waiting on her response. For some unknown reason, her inner feeling told her that this was a very important question. Sarah finally decided to answer honestly and simply. Yes, Dr. Grimes. I think I would have. Even knowing what would happen to you if you did? Yes, doctor, I think that is quite obvious considering how I look now. I think so too. Your reports from Dr. Robert indicate that your transformation has been quite smooth and incident-free. It is almost as if you wanted to be a girl. Sarah just smiled but said nothing. Dr. Grimes and the other female member of the board studied Sarah for a moment, and they both simultaneously burst into a huge smile. It was as if the two women could read Sarah's thoughts. The two men, however, just sat stoically, the unspoken communications going right over their heads. Sarah knew that she had 2 votes in her favor. She knew that she was halfway home. Continue, Miss Morton. Tell us about why you allowed yourself to be caught, stated the younger of the 2 men on the board. Well, it was not that I wanted to get caught. I really didn't go out of my way to allow that to happen. I knew what would happen if I did get discovered, and although I didn't agree with the law, I was not going to allow it to stop my desire to cross-dress. It was just that I got overconfident in my ability to fool everyone, and I got careless. Sarah paused to formulate her thoughts. She knew that whatever testimony she gave from this point on would weigh heavily on the board's final decision. She had to tell the truth, but she knew that it was up to her now to present it in a way that would be favorable for her. Mary and I had decided not to tell our folks about our intent to get married. Considering the presence of Sarah in the house, we felt it prudent not to put that pressure on them at the same time. After all, there was plenty of time, as we were not going to do that until Mary graduated. Nancy agreed with our decision and promised to keep our secret, although I think she was a little disappointed that we had decided to wait until summer recess to make the announcement. For the rest of the week after Christmas, I had made a point to dress full-time as a girl while in the house. Mom and the girls seemed to enjoy my little sojourn into the world of femininity. I don't think Daddy was too happy with the idea, but at least he held his peace and said nothing. It was only on New Year's Day that I reverted back to my male self for the 2-day drive back to school. I almost made a decision to drive back to Phoenix as Sarah, but Mary talked me out of it. She said that there was just too much of a risk of getting caught. After Mary and I had loaded up the car, we said our goodbyes to everyone and headed back to school. During the drive back, Mary had suggested that we make one stop. I at first objected, but her arguments were valid. If I ever got caught, I would be prevented from doing what she suggested. So, we stopped in Dallas for 2 days in order that I could deposit a couple of samples at the Texas Family Planning Center. Mary had insisted that I deposit at least 2 sperm samples at the sperm bank that facility maintained. Mary was determined that she was going to safeguard our future family just in case I did get caught. In retrospect, Mary had been quite astute. We arrived back at the university on the 4th of January. I dropped Mary off at her dorm, and after helping her unloading her things, I headed for my own meager flat. I set my suitcases in the hallway and hung my suit bag over the closet door as I came in. The first thing I wanted to do was to take a good long shower and wash off the road dust that I was sure clogged every pore of my body. I lingered in the shower for some time. I heard the phone ring, but I was not going to try to answer it. Instead, I let the voicemail pick up the call. I had started getting in the habit of shaving my legs and underarms. It just did not seem right to have all that extra hair if I was going to dress up. To tell the truth, that was the furthest thing from my mind at that moment. Still, I just felt that I needed to shave the darn hair off. After leaving the bathroom, I grabbed a robe and headed for the phone. As I expected, it was a message from Mary. "Hi, sweetie, it's me. I don't know if you unpacked yet, but I left a surprise in your suitcase. It's up to you if you want to use it. I'll be over at 6. Maybe we spend the night together. I don't have any classes tomorrow. Bye." I logged off the voicemail and went out and retrieved my luggage from the hallway and carried it into my bedroom. I opened the first suitcase and it contained nothing of a surprise. Just my normal attire and shaving kit. I found the surprise she mentioned in the other bag. It was the Alice wig and the nightie that I had found but not worn that first night we arrived at my folks'. There was also a white lace bra and a pair of breast forms. About a 36C it figured. I smiled. I could not help myself. That little minx. She has something up her sleeve, I said to myself. I decided to amuse her and laid the wig and nightie out on the bed. I looked at the clock on the dresser. It was 4:15. I had an hour and a half at least before Mary came over. What the heck, I thought. I might as well enjoy whatever Mary had in mind. I put on the bra and inserted the breast forms. I picked up the nightie and matching panties. They really were nice, I thought. I slipped into the nightie and donned the wig. A little makeup and I was transformed. I was starting to get quite surprised at how fast I could bring Sarah to life. I looked damned good, I thought. I went out into the kitchen and made a cup of tea. I found that I liked the sensuous feel of the nightie on my hairless body. I took the tea and went to the living room and turned on the TV. I decided to just relax and enjoy myself as Sarah until Mary arrived. I still had an hour to wait. I had made one small but fatal mistake. I had neglected to pull down one of my bedroom shades and had stood in front of that particular window while I donned my wig. I did not know that I was under surveillance at that time, or I would have been a lot more careful. I had underestimated the capabilities of the gender authorities. It was close to 5:45 that evening when my door was kicked in and I was discovered in my full glory as Sarah. I said nothing at that time. I just hoped that Mary would be a little late as she usually was. I did not want to implicate her as an accessory. I just let them put the cuffs on and lead me away. They did not even let me change. I think they wanted to get me photographed in my nightie and wig as evidence of my transgression. It was a couple of days later that I found out how devious the gender police were. They had been watching me since Halloween. Even though cross-dressing for a costume party was technically legal, it gave the authorities a hint of what a person was liable to do at other times. Neither Mary or I had thought of that possibility. In order to make an arrest, the gender police had to have some evidence. My standing in front of that window and being observed in the act of cross-dressing was all they needed. It is strange, I had been afraid of being caught while I was at my folks'. I never gave any thought to that possibility while I was in my own flat. Chapter 8. Sarah had been testifying for well over an hour when she was interrupted. The chairman of the board decided to call a recess. Miss Morton, if you are nearly finished with your testimony, you can rest your case at this point and we can make our judgment based on what you have presented so far, or we can take an hour's recess and continue at 8 p.m. Well, sir, I was planning to testify about my last 3 years living as a girl so that I could prove my seriousness of complying with the law. I really don't want to go to jail and my options are very limited. I would really like to exercise what options I do have available to me. Miss Morton. We do have a detailed report from Dr. Roberts that gives a chronological report of the last 3 years of your treatment and lifestyle. I and the other members of the board are quite familiar with all of that. I think we could wrap this up now favorably to you and save us all a lot of time. Yes, sir, I agree. Sarah replied in her well-practiced soft feminine voice. Good. One question. For the record. Do you wish to become a girl full-time and permanently, or do you wish to revert back to your male persona and the punishment that will go with it? Sir. I have gone too far at this point and I really do like the lifestyle that I have lived the last 3 years. I don't think I would fare well in a prison environment at this point. The judge looked at Sarah for a long moment. This court is in recess for 1 hour. We will reconvene at 8 p.m. for our decision in this matter. Everyone stood as the panel filed out and then Sarah left the hearing room. Nancy and Mary met her in the hallway. The two women and the almost woman embraced each other warmly. It was the first time that they had been able to get together since early morning. At that time the outcome looked a lot more uncertain. Dr. Roberts joined them in the corridor. "Sarah, ladies, if I may, can I invite you to some refreshments? There is a nice coffee shop still open across the street where we can wait for the hearing to reconvene," Dr. Roberts asked. Sarah looked at her court-appointed psychologist. She had come to respect him greatly for his real concern for her well-being both as Saul and as Sarah. "Thank you, doctor. That's most kind of you," Sarah replied. "It is my pleasure. You must be Sarah's sister Nancy?" Dr. Roberts asked, looking at Nancy. "I have been looking forward to meeting you for a long time. Sarah has told me all about you. Seems as though you are one heck of a lady." "Oh, not really, Dr. Roberts. I just care an awful lot for my brother, or I guess I should say my sister now." "So she tells me. That is a compliment to you. Both of you." As Dr. Roberts looked first at Nancy and then at Mary. This ordeal that Saul has had to go through has alienated many families. Especially siblings. "And why is that, doctor?" Nancy asked. Nancy took the doctor's proffered arm and Mary and Sarah followed behind holding hands as they headed out of the building and across the street towards the coffee shop. "Many factors, Nancy. Call it a sense of betrayal in some cases. Others are because one sibling feels a sense of rivalry developing. In others it is just that they cannot take the humiliation of having to explain to neighbors or friends why their brother wants to become a girl. It can even be a combination of all three and other factors. Generally there is always some sort of embarrassment for the family which results in alienation and hard feelings. In Sarah's case, however, there seems to be little of that. Except for my father, Kent. He is still having some problems with my being in this situation in the first place. He blames himself for not stopping me that Christmas week 3 years ago. Mother, of course, loves the idea of having another daughter to fuss over," Sarah said as a reply to the doctor's comments. The foursome were seated at a round table in the far corner of the coffee shop. Nancy and Mary sat on each side of Kent and Sarah sat directly across from him. Each ordered a light snack and waited for the waitress to leave before resuming their conversation. Kent Roberts turned his attention to Sarah. "So tell me, Sarah, are you comfortable with what will happen after the hearing? I am very confident that the board is going to allow you your freedom. Of course you do realize what that will mean." "Yes, I do, Kent. It will mean that I will be forever a woman. Am I completely okay with that?" "No. Would you be? But it is a lot better than the alternative. Look at these, Kent. 34B bra and still growing. No balls between my legs for that last 3 years. Hell, I guess I should be used to it by now," Sarah replied. Just a hint of aggravation in her voice. "Only thing I miss is trying to get Mary pregnant the old-fashioned way." Kent looked over at Mary, who had turned a beet shade of red at her lover's comment. "Really, Saul? That was not nice," Mary said. "Well, it's true, dear. I know we have an option, but I will miss the other way." The rest of the hour passed swiftly. Dr. Roberts did manage to get Nancy to agree to meet him for dinner later in the week. Mary and Sarah exchanged knowing glances at that. In reality, that would be a nice match if anything did develop. Chapter 9. Sarah took her seat at the witness table. She looked over at Mary and Nancy seated in the galley. They each gave her a thumbs up as a sign of encouragement. Turning her attention to the chairman of the hearing board, Sarah waited to hear the decision that would seal her hate for the remainder of her life. Sarah and Morton, please rise and hear the findings of this board. Sarah rose slowly. She could feel the weakness in her legs. This is it, she thought to herself. Miss Morton, it is the finding of this board that you have complied with all of the requirements that were imposed on you at the time of your conviction of violating the federal statutes against crossdressing. I would like to point out that it is our conclusion that you did not violate these laws for any purpose that was intended to deceive the public or to hide your identity for the purpose of committing a crime. It appears to us that your acts were solely for self-gratification, and because of these extenuating circumstances we feel that it would not be in the public's best interests to send you to jail. However, we are duty-bound to uphold the laws as they are currently on the books as regards punishment. Therefore, since you have agreed to and have fulfilled the requirements that you be castrated and have received estrogen therapy and have lived full-time as a woman for the last 3 years, it is the sentence of this board that you be taken immediately to the National Health Institute facility in Phoenix and there submit to a completion of the gender reassignment program. It is our hope that you can and will become a productive and contributing member of the female population. The members of the board looked straight at Sarah as the chairman continued. Do you, Sarah and Morton, accept these terms of acceptance? Sarah took a moment before replying. She took a deep breath and looking straight at the chairman and in a firm and confident voice replied, Yes, sir, I do. Good for you, young lady. If I may speak for the entire board, we wish you well. You have 1 hour to meet with your family privately before you will be transported. Good luck to you, Miss Morton. This hearing regarding the case of the United States versus Solly Morton, aka Sarah and Morton, is now concluded. Sarah sat back down. She buried her face in her hands. She wept. So it had all come down to this. She thought through her tears. She could not help feel a great deal of relief that she was not going to spend most of the rest of her life in jail. But the thought that she was about to become a girl in the true sense was overwhelming. She had never considered that her cross-dressing escapades would lead to permanent life in dresses. It had been fun, but now it was to be the norm. But still. She let the thought die as she became aware of Mary and Nancy's presence beside her. She looked up at each of them in turn and she wept even harder. Nancy and Mary managed to get Sarah to her feet and took her to the private lounge just outside the hearing room. 10 minutes later, Sarah had regained her composure sufficiently to become aware that both her mother and father had entered the room and were standing quietly at the back of the room. Mom, Daddy was all she managed to get out as both her parents rushed to her and hugged her. Nancy and Mary joined the trio, and for a couple of more minutes the 4 adults formed a circle around Sarah, and together they shared their last moments with the boy who was about to become a girl for real. Saul Morton may have had to endure the experiences of living like a woman for the past 3 years, and he may have stood before the chairman and state that he would agree to the terms of acceptance that he had been offered, but in actuality he had a long way to go. It would only be during the next year that he, or should I say she, would really come to understand what becoming a true female was to entail. The first crisis was actually only a few hours away. This time would test the resolve that Sarah/Saul had built up during those previous 3 years. Chapter 8. Sarah had been testifying for well over an hour when she was interrupted. The chairman of the board decided to call a recess. Miss Morton, if you are nearly finished with your testimony, you can rest your case at this point and we can make our judgment based on what you have presented so far, or we can take an hour's recess and continue at 8 p.m. Well, sir, I was planning to testify about my last 3 years living as a girl so that I could prove my seriousness of complying with the law. I really don't want to go to jail and my options are very limited. I would really like to exercise what options I do have available to me. Miss Morton. We do have a detailed report from Dr. Roberts that gives a chronological report of the last 3 years of your treatment and lifestyle. I and the other members of the board are quite familiar with all of that. I think we could wrap this up now favorably to you and save us all a lot of time. Yes, sir, I agree. Sarah replied in her well-practiced soft feminine voice. Good. One question, for the record, do you wish to become a girl full-time and permanently, or do you wish to revert back to your male persona and the punishment that will go with it? Sir, I have come too far at this point, and I really do like the lifestyle that I have lived the last 3 years. I don't think I would fare well in a prison environment. The judge looked at Sarah for a long moment. This court is in recess for 1 hour. We will reconvene at 8 p.m. for our decision in this matter. Everyone stood as the panel filed out, and then Sarah left the hearing room. Nancy and Mary met her in the hallway. The two women and the almost woman embraced each other warmly. It was the first time that they had been able to get together since early morning. At that time the outcome looked a lot more uncertain. Dr. Roberts joined them in the corridor. Sarah, ladies, if I may, can I invite you to some refreshments? There is a nice coffee shop still open across the street where we can wait for the hearing to reconvene. Dr. Roberts asked. Sarah looked at her court-appointed psychologist. She had come to respect him greatly for his real concern for her well-being both as Saul and as Sarah. Thank you, doctor. That's most kind of you. Sarah replied. It is my pleasure. You must be Sarah's sister Nancy? Dr. Roberts asked, looking at Nancy. I have been looking forward to meeting you for a long time. Sarah has told me all about you. Seems as though you are one heck of a lady. Oh, not really, Dr. Roberts. I just care an awful lot for my brother, or I guess I should say my sister now. So she tells me. That is a compliment to you. Both of you. As Dr. Roberts looked first at Nancy and then at Mary. This ordeal that Saul has had to go through has alienated many families. Especially siblings. And why is that, doctor? Nancy asked. Nancy took the doctor's proffered arm, and Mary and Sarah followed behind, holding hands as they headed out of the building and across the street towards the coffee shop. Many factors, Nancy. Call it a sense of betrayal in some cases. Others are because one sibling feels a sense of rivalry developing. In others it is just that they cannot take the humiliation of having to explain to neighbors or friends why their brother wants to become a girl. It can even be a combination of all three and other factors. Generally there is always some sort of embarrassment for the family, which results in alienation and hard feelings. In Sarah's case, however, there seems to be little of that. Except for my father, Kent. He is still having some problems with my being in this situation in the first place. He blames himself for not stopping me that Christmas week 3 years ago. Mother, of course, loves the idea of having another daughter to fuss over. Sarah said as a reply to the doctor's comments. The foursome were seated at a round table in the far corner of the coffee shop. Nancy and Mary sat on each side of Kent, and Sarah sat directly across from him. Each ordered a light snack and waited for the waitress to leave before resuming their conversation. Kent Roberts turned his attention to Sarah. So tell me, Sarah, are you comfortable with what will happen after the hearing? I am very confident that the board is going to allow you your freedom. Of course you do realize what that will mean. Yes, I do, Kent. It will mean that I will be forever a woman. Am I completely okay with that? No. Would you be? But it is a lot better than the alternative. Look at these, Kent. 34B bra and still growing. No balls between my legs for that last 3 years. Hell, I guess I should be used to it by now. Sarah replied. Just a hint of aggravation in her voice. Only thing I miss is trying to get Mary pregnant the old-fashioned way. Kent looked over at Mary, who had turned a beet shade of red at her lover's comment. Really, Saul? That was not nice. Mary said. Well, it's true, dear. I know we have an option, but I will miss the other way. The rest of the hour passed swiftly. Dr. Roberts did manage to get Nancy to agree to meet him for dinner later in the week. Mary and Sarah exchanged knowing glances at that. In reality, that would be a nice match if anything did develop. Sarah took her seat at the witness table. She looked over at Mary and Nancy seated in the galley. They each gave her a thumbs up as a sign of encouragement. Turning her attention to the chairman of the hearing board, Sarah waited to hear the decision that would seal her hate for the remainder of her life. Sarah and Morton, please rise and hear the findings of this board. Sarah rose slowly. She could feel the weakness in her legs. This is it, she thought to herself. Miss Morton. It is the finding of this board that you have complied with all of the requirements that were imposed on you at the time of your conviction of violating the federal statutes against cross-dressing. I would like to point out that it is our conclusion that you did not violate these laws for any purpose that was intended to deceive the public or to hide your identity for the purpose of committing a crime. It appears to us that your acts were solely for self-gratification, and because of these extenuating circumstances we feel that it would not be in the public's best interests to send you to jail. However, we are duty-bound to uphold the laws as they are currently on the books as regards punishment. Therefore, since you have agreed to and have fulfilled the requirements that you undergo estrogen therapy and have lived full-time as a woman for the last 3 years, it is the sentence of this board that you be taken immediately to the National Health Institute facility in Phoenix and there submit to the surgical completion of your gender reassignment program. It is our hope that you can and will become a productive and contributing member of the female population. The members of the board looked straight at Sarah as the chairman continued. Do you, Sarah and Morton, agree to these terms of acceptance? Sarah took a moment before replying. She took a deep breath and looking straight at the chairman and in a firm and confident voice replied, Yes, sir, I do. Good for you, young lady. If I may speak for the entire board, we wish you well. You have 2 hours to meet with your family privately before you will be transported to Phoenix. Good luck to you, Miss Morton. This hearing regarding the case of the United States versus Saul A. Morton, now to be known as Sarah and Morton, is now concluded. Sarah sat back down. She buried her face in her hands. She wept. So it had all come down to this. She thought through her tears. She could not help feel a great deal of relief that she was not going to spend most of the rest of her life in jail. But the thought that she was about to become a girl in the true sense was overwhelming. She had never considered that her cross-dressing escapades would lead to permanent life in dresses. It had been fun, but now it was to be the norm. But still, she let the thought die as she became aware of Mary and Nancy's presence beside her. She looked up at each of them in turn and she wept even harder. Nancy and Mary managed to get Sarah to her feet and took her to the private lounge just outside the hearing room. 10 minutes later, Sarah had regained her composure sufficiently to become aware that her father had entered the room and was standing quietly at the back of the room. Daddy was all she managed to get out as Daniel Morton rushed her and hugged her. Nancy and Mary joined the do, and for a couple of more minutes the three of them formed a circle around Sarah, and together they shared their last moments with the boy who was about to become a girl for real. Sarah looked around furtively. Where's Mother? Didn't she come with you? She asked. She was not feeling well, but she said that she would see you at the hospital in a couple of days. Her father replied. Are you sure she is all right? You're not hiding anything, are you? Sarah asked, obvious anxiety in her voice. No, Saul. It is just a bad case of the stomach virus. She will be fine. Sarah visibly relaxed at this assurance. During the next 2 hours, Sarah's father rediscovered his child. He came to understand at least a little that the last 3 years had lost him a son but gained for him a new daughter. Saul Morton may have had to endure the experiences of living like a woman for the past 3 years, and he may have stood before the chairman and state that he would agree to the terms of acceptance that he had been offered, but in actuality he had a long way to go. It would only be during the next year that he, or should I say she, would really come to understand what becoming a true female was to entail. The first crisis was actually only a few hours away. This time would test the resolve that Sarah/Saul had built up during those previous 3 years. Chapter 9. Nancy and her father said their goodbyes as the 2 hours drew to a close. Daniel Morton had finally come to grips with what was about to happen to his son and had reconciled himself to the fact that he was about to gain another daughter. He made a point of telling Saul this and made him promise that he and Mary would come and stay with him and his mother during his recuperation. Saul was relieved immensely. He knew that although he was physically more female now than male due to the overpowering influence of the estrogen coursing through his body, he knew that once he was transgendered, he would need all the support he could get. Saul had hugged his father like he had never done before, even as a child. Daniel had returned this in kind. Saul promised that he would come when it was all over. Mary had spent the last 15 minutes alone with Saul. Not much was said as she had come to accept that nothing else could be done to prevent the inevitable. The conversation between them was strained. "Did they tell you when you can go home, Saul?" Mary asked. "They told me that these new laser techniques are quite thorough and heal quite rapidly. So if no complications arise, I will be released in 4 or 5 days. But you can visit me day after tomorrow." "You know I will, Saul. Do you want me to bring anything?" "Not really. Whatever you want, I guess. I did pack a few things that I will probably need." "So what happens now? When will they operate?" "Tomorrow morning. They don't wait too long. They said it was to prevent unnecessary anxiety." Boy, is that an understatement. 3 years being prepped for this, and I am still a nervous wreck. "Saul, I will miss you. I know after it is all done you will still be you but as a girl, but I will miss you as a man. I still love you. You know that, don't you?" Mary asked almost pleadingly. "Mary, I still love you too. But, can you know, as a woman does with another woman?" Mary threw her arms around Saul and kissed him hard. "You wait and see if I can," Mary replied as she pulled away. Sarah/Saul sat in the back seat of the air car. The female court officer beside him was courteous enough not to try to engage him in conversation. She was astute enough to know that this was not a good time to talk to those she was escorting to Forced SRS. The trip was only about 10 minutes by air car anyway. Not really enough time to engage in a conversation. Saul was thankful for the woman's silence. The air car landed on the roof of the National Health Institute's hospital and the female escort took Sarah down to the reception desk. After signing some paperwork, the girl turned to Sarah and said, "Good luck, dear." She gave Saul a friendly light kiss on the cheek and was gone. Saul was then escorted by a young nurse to a semi-private room on the 3rd floor. The second bed was unoccupied. "You may hang your dress in the closet, Miss Morton. If you wish, the rest of your garments will be cleaned and returned to you before you leave. You may put them in the hamper in the lavatory. Please put on the hospital gown and get into the bed by the window when you are finished changing and have unpacked your suitcase. It is quite late and we will not have anything else to do tonight. The morning nurse will be in at 7 a.m. to prep you." The nurse turned and left the room without waiting for Saul's reply. Saul did as instructed. He removed the light blue dress he was wearing and hung it up in the closet. He took off his slip and removed his pantyhose. He unsnapped his bra and placed the undergarments in the hamper. Standing in front of the mirror, he examined his body. 3 years of hormones had had its effect. His 34B breasts were well developed and his skin had taken on a small layer of fat that made his skin quite soft. He had lost most of his body hair and what was left was quite soft and downy. Except for his male genitalia and some masculine features in his face, he had a fairly feminine body. His hair had grown quite long during the past 3 years, was straight full-bodied, reaching all the way to the small of his back. Saul took his brush and brushed it out. At one point his hair brushed across his nipples and he felt them respond to the touch. He shivered as they responded and sent an electric shock down to his groin. He had come a long way and was paying dearly for his cross-dressing transgressions. Saul sighed. He finished putting his hair into a French braid, one of the techniques that Mary had taught him to do before going to bed. He went to the bathroom and relieved himself. It struck him that this was the last time he would be able to pee standing up. He felt a pang of regret overtake him. This was it, he thought. They are going to do it to me tomorrow. As he got into the bed, a sense of melancholy overtook him. He started to cry. He cried himself to sleep, almost like a little girl. It had been a long, exhausting day and full of fear and trepidation about his future. He just wanted it over so that he could get on with the rest of his life. Chapter 10. 14 miles away on a remote hillside, a lightning storm was in progress. A bolt of lightning hit a long-distance telephone relay station. The long-distance lines went out. Saul had lain awake for over an hour. The early morning light streaming in the windows signaling the start of a new day. Saul looked at it as the start of a new life. He lay in the bed waiting. He knew that it would not be long before they would come and get him and turn him into a girl for real. He could feel the anxiety building inside the pit of his stomach. A sense of regret overtaking him for the events that had led him to this moment. He wished that he could go back 3 years and not go to that stupid costume party. He started to have doubts about becoming a female. He had convinced himself that he wanted to do this, but now that he was committed and there was no going back, he was having second thoughts. Saul was not able to contain the tears that streamed down his face. This is a hell of a time to have second thoughts, he said to himself. His self-pity was interrupted as an orderly wheeled in a gurney followed by a doctor and a nurse. The orderly turned and left the room. "Good morning, Miss Morton. I am Dr. Hendricks. I am to be your surgeon today. This is Nurse Simpson. She will prep you for surgery. I have gone over your medical records and barring any last-minute complications, we should be ready for you in a few minutes. Do you feel well? Any colds or illness in the past week?" "No, nothing. Just a case of nerves at the moment," Saul replied. "That's understandable considering what you are about to have happen. I am obligated under the law to ask you if you want to reconsider. You have been given a reduction of sentence in response to your cooperative attitude since your original sentence. If you wish, we can forego this operation and you will be sent to the Federal Correctional Facility for only 10 years instead of the original 30 to 50-year sentence. We will of course stop all hormone requirements and your body will return to a semblance of normalcy within a year or so. During that time you will be kept here so that we can help your transition back." Saul was shocked. He had not expected this reduction. His mind started to work overtime. He could keep his manhood if he was willing to spend 10 years in jail. He started to cry. The estrogen working its magic on his emotions. His thoughts working overtime as he considered the possibilities. He had after all had to learn how to live, act and respond as a woman as part of his transition. He knew that he would never be able to fully return to his former self. At best, he would be considered an effeminate male. Was he willing to accept this along with 10 years in prison? Saul made up his mind. No, doctor. It is too late for that. Let's just do what has to be done so that I can at least start a new life. Saul said with a broken voice. Fine. I think that is best as well. The nurse will give you an injection to calm you down a bit. She will then prep you and take your vitals. One last question, Sarah. Do you wish to have a local and be awake, or would you prefer to be asleep? I told the anesthesiologist on the phone yesterday that I would prefer to be asleep. I haven't changed my mind on that. Okay, Sarah. The SRS operation takes 3 or 4 hours. But with the addition surgery to implant your new reproductive organs and the feminization of your features and voice, you will be under for more like 7 or 8 hours. That is a long time to lay on the table awake. We prefer our patients to be awake. Less chance of complications. But in your case, I think total anesthesia it is a better choice. We will keep you asleep until tomorrow morning in order to give your body some healing time without you having to endure the initial pain. When it is all over, I will come around to see you. Thank you, doctor. I appreciate your candor. Saul replied. You're welcome. See you soon. The doctor turned and left the room. The nurse for the most part was very professional. She said very little except to instruct Saul to turn this way or that as she gave him an injection and took his vitals. She lifted up the hem of Saul's hospital gown and proceeded to shave his groin. She was quite adept and was done in less time than Saul used to spend shaving his face. She applied a coat of antiseptic to his genitals and was done. She packed up her tray, and as she turned to leave she looked at Saul for a moment. She smiled. Good luck, Mr. Morton. I don't really agree with this law, but we must follow it. What they are doing to you is a shame, but if I may be so bold, it is not at all bad to be a girl. It is a lot better than you think. I know. I have been on both sides of the fence. She winked and was gone. Saul was amazed. He would never have guessed that that pretty nurse had ever been a man. Saul felt a lot better because of her remarks. 30 minutes later, as Saul lay unconscious in the operating room, the first part of his total transformation was completed as 2 small, obviously atrophied testicles were dropped into a beaker of formaldehyde. Sarah had finally been born into reality. This is a CNN breaking news commentary. Washington, D.C. Congress today passed and the President immediately signed a bill that revokes the controversial gender reassignment law. The law was revoked when an amendment was attached at the last minute without debate to the Justice Department's Supplemental Appropriations Bill. Analysts reported that there was no debate as this law that made sex changes mandatory for cross-dressers was being challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court. Apparently, it was the opinion of most congressmen that this law would be thrown out by the justices, and Congress, being in an election year, felt that this unpopular law, if revoked by the members, would serve well in their individual elections. The terms of the revocation stated that no further forced gender reassignments would take place after 6 a.m. today at any of the country's 5 centers. Since no surgeries are scheduled on Wednesdays, it is assumed that no other impositions of this punishment will take place. All those persons imprisoned or under sentence will be released or granted full pardons immediately. More will follow as it becomes available. Mary turned off the TV that she had been watching while passing the time until she could ring up the hospital. The announcement came as a surprise. There had been no indication that the law was going to be changed. She picked up the phone and called the hospital. No, Miss Harrison, we have not heard anything like that. said the secretary. "One moment, please." The woman picked up the schedule for the day's surgical procedures. She looked at the listing and then at her notes. She went to the fax machine and took out the printout that had just been transmitted. She gasped. "I'm sorry, Miss Harrison. The operation is just about over. We just received the fax. I am afraid it is too late." "Yes. I will check again. I will let you know. Goodbye." Without knocking, she went into the director's office. The director, a balding man of about 50 years old, looked up at the secretary as she came in. It was obvious from the look on her face that there was a problem. "What is it, Susan? You look like you have seen a ghost." "Sir, I think we have a problem." She handed him the fax and the schedule. "Oh shit," he said as he picked up the phone and called the operating room. Dr. Hendricks hung up the phone. He was sweating. He had scheduled this surgery at the last minute. It was Wednesday. No surgeries were normally scheduled on Wednesdays as most doctors were not available. He had decided to do this SRS case only because his golf game was canceled and his wife was out of town. He had nothing scheduled and had decided to get this one case out of the way. He knew that he was in big trouble. He knew that the Institute's policy was not to use the operating room on Wednesdays, but that they also did not enforce it. Hendricks was sure that today they would make an exception. The Institute did not like lawsuits and they tended to find a scapegoat if possible. At 2 p.m. the plastic surgeon was well into the process of reconstructing Sarah's face. The SRS surgery along with the implantation of donor ovaries, fallopian tubes and womb. The bundling of Sarah's vocal cords had also been completed. The improvements in microlaser surgery and tissue matching had come a long way since the millennium. Tissue rejection and organ transplants was a thing of the past. Chapter 11. Sarah came awake slowly. The gray shadows giving way to the light that was streaming in the window. Her eyes fluttered open finally. Her face was partially covered in bandages, although there were openings that allowed her to see. For a minute or so she struggled to recollect where she was. Then she remembered. It seemed like only a moment ago she had been staring up at the lights in the operating room ceiling. But she was now in her room. There was something different though. She tried to figure it out. Finally she did. She was in a private room. Much nicer than the one she had been in earlier. Much more cheery, she thought. The door to her room opened and the nurse who had prepped her for surgery came into the room. "Good morning, Sarah. I'm Tiffany Barrett. I will be your attending nurse until you are discharged. Don't try to speak yet. The incisions in your face and neck need to heal for another day. The swelling should be mostly gone by tomorrow. I am going to give you an injection to keep the pain down and help you to relax." The nurse placed a pad of paper and a pencil on the bed beside Sarah. "Sarah, if you need to ask for anything you can write it on the pad and that way I will know what you are asking or need. Dr. Hendricks will be in to see you in an hour or so. In the meantime I will start in 4 for you nourishment. You will not be allowed to eat anything until tomorrow. If you need me just press the button and I will come right in." Tiffany placed the hand switch on the bed next to Sarah's hand. Sarah picked up the pad and wrote a message on it. "I knew you were going to ask that, dear. It is always the first thing that an SRS patient asks. Yes, it is all over. There were no complications and you are going to make a very pretty girl. Congratulations. Welcome to womanhood, dear. And yes, it is morning. You have been asleep for almost 24 hours. Sarah wrote again. Tiffany read the note and smiled. Yes, she is Sarah. She called yesterday afternoon and we told her that everything was fine. She will be here this afternoon to visit. But right now you need to rest for a while longer. Deep inside her mind, Sarah felt relief and fear at the same time. Her time of humiliation was over, but the fear of the future seemed like a wave rising up out of the very depths of her soul. Her concern was for Mary. How would she react to this change? As Saul. He and Mary had talked long and seriously of the implications of his loss of manhood. Now that it had happened, Sarah was not sure if Mary would be able to accept it for real. Mary had told him that it would not matter in the least, but Sarah was still worried. She fell back to sleep. Nurse Barrett just smiled and left the room. Sarah opened her eyes to the sound of noise in the room. Mary was sitting in the armchair next to the window. "Mary, hi," she said weakly, more a squeak than words, as the pain in her throat well up and reminded her that she was not supposed to talk. "Shush. The nurse said not to let you talk, sweetie." Sarah picked up the pad and started to write. She noticed that her nails had been manicured and a red polish applied. She examined her hands and looked at Mary inquiringly. "Oh, I did that while you were asleep, Honorable. I thought you might like it. You looked like you could use some cheering up. Besides, you might as well get used to it. It is expected now." Saul had made a point of not wearing much makeup during the time he had been forced to dress like a girl. It was his way of protesting what they were doing to him. True, he had been required to dress and act like a girl in public, and that the hormones had made that a lot easier, but the use of cosmetics had not been a stipulation, and he had used that along with the fact that he could dress as a man in the privacy of his own flat as a form of mild rebellion. "I know, Saul," Mary said. She knew what was going through her lover's head. "But you're not a man anymore. You're a girl now, and you might as well enjoy it. It is one of the things that we girls take pride in, and you might as well too." Sarah handed a note to Mary. As Mary read it, she laughed. "Well, would you at least stop calling me Saul then? It probably isn't very appropriate now." The note said. "Okay. I don't think Saul is right either, Sarah. It is just that it is going to take some getting used to. After all, it isn't every day that a girl looks at what was to be her future husband and sees that he has become her girlfriend. I wouldn't know. I really haven't seen much of my new self yet. You can break it off between us. I would understand." Sarah wrote. "Not on your life, sweetie. We will make do. It will just be a little different, that's all. You just wait till you are back home. You'll see. I have a few surprises for you," Mary said with a hint of humor in her reply. "Look, Sarah. I have to go now." "The nurse?" "Tiffany said only a 2-hour visit today, and that is almost up. I'll see you tomorrow. Okay?" Mary asked more as a statement than a question. She leaned over and kissed Sarah on the bandage over her mouth. "I'll bring some things with me then." Mary turned and was gone. Sarah felt a loneliness well up inside her as she watched Mary disappear through the door. Dr. Hendricks came into Sarah's room a short time after Mary had departed. He was accompanied by another man who was also wearing a white lab coat. The embroidery over the pocket said staff. "Hello, Sarah. This is Dr. Peter Benson. He is a staff psychologist. I hope you don't mind, but it is necessary for him to evaluate your post-op well-being." "Nice to meet you, Sarah," the older man said. "Hello, Dr. Benson. If you are here to see if I have gone over the top and jumped into the loony bin, you will be quite disappointed," she wrote on her notepad. Dr. Benson chuckled after reading the note. I'm glad you have a sense of humor after all you have been through. That's a good sign. Do you mind if I sit? He asked, pointing to the chair in the corner of the room. Sarah shook her head, indicating a no. She did not mind. Hendricks came alongside the bed and took her pulse. He checked the pupils of her eyes. Taking a pair of scissors, he cut away the bandages from around her mouth. Gently, he placed a tongue depressor in her mouth and checked her throat. He smiled. Good, you seem to be coming along well, Sarah. Right now I would just like to see how I look without all these bandages and tubes sticking in me. Sarah replied. I think we can accommodate you there, Sarah. You are healing nicely. More rapidly than I thought. I want you to practice talking now. But only short words, and stop if you feel any severe pain. And don't worry if your voice sounds funny. It will be a few days before you will have your new voice working correctly. Okay? Sarah wrote yes on her pad. Now I want you to understand that we did quite a bit of reconstruction on your face and throat, and even with microsurgery there is going to be some swelling and discoloration. But it will subside and should totally disappear in about 10 days. I guarantee you will be quite pleased with your new features. As for your new plumbing, we will wait until tomorrow to unhook you. Hendricks paused, looking away at the other doctor. Sarah could sense that something was not right. She noticed that the doctor was hedging. Fidgeting more the word. What's wrong, doctor? You seem to be holding back something. I can feel it. Sarah said with some difficulty. May I sit down, Sarah? Hendricks said, pointing to the chair beside the bed. Sarah said nothing. She just nodded her head. Fear rising up inside of her. For the next 15 minutes Hendricks told the girl lying on the bed about the revocation of the gender laws. He was most apologetic in his explanation about how the surgery was almost completed when they had received the news, and it was too late to stop at that point. Sarah listened to the explanation without saying a word. The bandages on her face hiding her expressions. Hendricks finished his explanation of what had happened and why. I'm sorry, Sarah. It seems like such an injustice that you had to go through this and have the law changed just a few hours too late. So, can you change me back, Dr. Sarah asked. No. It is too late for that. Too many changes have been made to your body. You would not be able to withstand another sex reassignment. Besides, you are missing a few parts now. So I'm stuck like this permanently? Sarah asked bluntly. An edge to her voice. I'm afraid so. Dr. Hendricks replied. Okay then, doctor. You are going to have to pay for this little error. Oh, was all Hendricks could say at the moment. You are going to treat Mary, Nancy, and I to a nice dinner when I get out of here. Sarah giggled. Deal. Hendricks replied, obviously relieved. It will be my pleasure. Dr. Benson wrote a couple of notes in his book and silently got up and left the room. Sarah never noticed him leave. On Friday morning, true to his word, Dr. Hendricks removed all the catheter tubes and bandages from her body. He explained that for a few days she would feel a lot of discomfort when she needed to use the toilet. He explained the need to take extra care in cleaning her new urethra's opening to prevent infection. He left her an antibiotic ointment to apply each time she passes water. Sarah was now functioning on her own. The nurse, Tiffany, came in after the doctor had departed. She was carrying a large hand mirror. With Tiffany's help, Sarah was finally going to examine the results of the surgery. She also got her first experience with and instructions in the use of a dilator. You will need to use this 2 or 3 times a day for the next couple of months or so, Sarah. She had not given that part of this experience any thought. The sight of that semi-rigid latex imitation of a penis had made Sarah quite embarrassed, but Tiffany had assured her that it was quite necessary to prevent her body from closing up the new opening. Just make sure you apply that ointment around the opening before you insert the shaft, Tiffany remarked, pointing to the jar that the doctor had left. It's good for both? Sarah asked. Yes, it is. Antibiotic in a KY jelly base, Tiffany said with a smile. The logic of the explanation made sense, but it did not make it any easier for Sarah to accept this first and very intimate female necessity. Now let's get you out of that bed and into the bathroom. You need to try out the new plumbing. I'll help you this first time, and after that you're on your own, the girl stated. 10 minutes later, her body's needs satisfied, quite painfully and embarrassingly as well, Sarah was helped back to the bed. This time, however, she sat on the edge instead of getting into it. Tiffany held the mirror out to Sarah. Moment of truth, dear. Do you want to see what you look like? Sarah took the mirror with shaking hands. She looked at the nurse with some trepidation in her eyes. Tiffany sensed this and nodded her head. Go ahead, Sarah, she said and smiled. Welling up a reserve of confidence, Sarah held the mirror in front of her face. She gasped. Several seconds passed and then Sarah stated excitedly, I'm pretty, Tiffany. Yes, you are, dear. Very pretty. How about if I brush out your hair and get you presentable? Then we will take a walk down the hall. You need to get some exercise. Besides, you have company coming this morning. Thank you, Tiffany. I would like that, Sarah said happily. It was later that morning when Mary, accompanied by Nancy, arrived carrying a large bouquet of flowers and a large pink and white teddy bear and several other packages. Sarah was sitting up in bed when the two women entered the room. Sarah felt a lot better. Tiffany had brushed out her long hair into 2 ponytails and had tied it on each side of her head with some red ribbon. Sarah had even allowed Tiffany to apply some lipstick to give a little color to her lips and a touch of blush to her cheeks. Sarah actually felt human again, if not actually feminine. Well, look at this, Nancy said as she entered the room. Do I actually see my new sister smiling? And wearing lipstick? Hi, sis. Don't start. I do have to look the part now, don't I? Sarah replied good-naturedly. Gee, Sarah, you look wonderful. How are you doing inside? Mary said as she planted a kiss on Sarah's cheek. I don't know, Mary. I think I will be okay with this. After all, I have had 3 years training now, Sarah responded seriously. For a few moments the 3 young women just looked at each other but said nothing. Nancy, as usual, broke the awkward silence. Hey, let's knock off the gloom. Sarah, wait until you see what we brought you. She reached into one of the packages and took out a box. It was gift-wrapped and had a label on it, which said, to my new daughter. Hurry home. Your father. Sarah took the package and tore open the wrapping. She started to cry. In the box was a pretty pink A-line skirt and matching jacket with delicate white flowers embroidered in a heart shape over a small pocket on the right breast and on the cuffs of the sleeves. Oh, Nancy, it is beautiful, Sarah said with a cracking voice. Sarah, Daddy did not know how to express his feelings in writing, but I think you can get the idea from his gift. He picked it out himself. And you know how he hated to go shopping, especially in the women's department. And he is coming to pick us up tomorrow and take us back home. The doctors said that you are healing so well that they are discharging you tomorrow. Tiffany? The nurse? She is coming with us. The institute is paying her salary for the next 2 weeks to look after you, Mary said excitedly, without stopping for breath. Sarah was surprised. Tiffany had not said a word about that. Really? What brought that on? The feds are not usually that generous. Lawsuits, I think. They are afraid you may sue. Nancy replied, a note of sarcasm in her voice. Anyway, look what else we brought, Mary stated as she handed Sarah another package. This will get you out of that hospital gown. Sarah opened the package. It was a mint green nylon sleeping gown with ivory lace trim on the neckline and sleeves. There was also a matching cotton lounging robe. You know, Mary, I never allowed myself to wear these things before, Sarah said with mock seriousness. I know. But I think that it is quite appropriate now. Don't you think? Mary replied. Nancy just giggled. I never could win when you both ganged up on me. Okay, help me get into this thing, Sarah said. Chapter 12. As it turned out, it was 2 days before Sarah was released. Dr. Hendricks had found some mild infection around the incision on Sarah's abdomen and had decided to treat her with antibiotics for an extra day. On Sunday morning, Sarah was discharged. She had decided to wear her new pink outfit and a light ivory blouse that Mary had brought with her that morning. As with all hospitals, Sarah had to get into a wheelchair in order to leave the grounds. It was her father that had come into the room, wheelchair in hand. He had insisted that he be the one to escort his new daughter out of the hospital. The orderly had obliged. Nancy and Mary, followed by Tiffany, left the hospital and went to the air-car pad on the roof. Several minutes passed before Daniel Morton, pushing his daughter's wheelchair, came onto the roof. The chauffeur opened the side door and helped Sarah inside. Tiffany pushed the wheelchair back to the door and then returned and got inside with Mary, Nancy, and Daniel Morton. Tiffany fussed over her charge, adjusting the belts so that they did not irritate the surgery points. Nancy and Mary smiled as they watched the young nurse do her administrations. Finally, they were off the roof and on their way home. Sarah was asleep within minutes. The exertion of getting ready to make the trip had tired her. Sarah woke with a start as the air car landed. We here already? Sarah asked. Sure, our sleepy head. You slept all the way, Mary answered. Sarah looked out the window of the air car. She could see her mother standing on the porch with one of the maids. Sarah seemed to sense a look of tiredness about her. She seemed to be stooping more than the last time she had seen her. As they walked up the path towards the house, Sarah, leaning on her father's arm for support, asked, Dad? Is Mom okay? Sure. Why do you ask? Oh, I don't know. I saw her from the window and she looks tired. Probably just worry over you, that's all. I'll bet she comes around real quick when she sees how you have changed. She has been working real hard getting ready for your return. A real tyrant the last week, getting everything just right. Oh, Dad, what's so special about this visit? It is not like she hasn't seen me in a dress before. No, Sarah, but not as her daughter. Sarah did not know how to reply, so she let the comment go unanswered. As they drew close to the porch, Sarah could detect no sign of anything wrong. Louise Morton stood proud and straight as she always did. Nancy and Mary, who had been walking ahead of Sarah and Daniel, greeted Louise and went immediately into the house with the maid. Daniel and Sarah climbed the stairs and, with an unspoken word passing between himself and his wife, left Sarah on the porch with her mother and went inside as well. Louise took Sarah's hands in each of hers and held Sarah at arm length for several long moments. She looked her new daughter in the eyes. Saul, you are beautiful, "Are you okay with this?" Louise asked. Her question obviously tempered with genuine concern. Sarah did not know how to answer. In one respect she liked her new form and appearance, yet on the other hand she knew that she would always miss her manhood to some extent. The fact that it was taken away forcefully was upsetting to a great degree. "I guess I will have to now, won't I, Mother? It really isn't that bad." "I guess so. But your father and I love you no matter how you look, dear." "Thank you for that, Mom. You have no idea how much that means to me." "Welcome home, Sarah." Louise pulled her new daughter to her and hugged her tightly. Sarah returned the hug likewise in return, both women shedding tears of joy. Daniel stood in the living room with Nancy and Mary as they watched through the windows of the French doors. Mary and Nancy both held an arm of the elder Morton and kissed him lightly on the cheek. He said nothing, but the tears running down his face gave evidence to his happiness and reconciliation. All three girls took the following year off as a sabbatical from their classes. Sarah healed perfectly, and with the help of Mary, Nancy, and Louise, she grew in her womanhood both physically and emotionally. Epilogue. 14 months passed. Sarah had learned her lessons well. She had become very self-sufficient both in her mannerisms and her ability to care for her new body. She had had a somewhat awkward and painful experience when she experienced her first menses, but the other women of the household had helped her through that compassion and understanding. Sarah developed a conservative taste in the way she dressed, and when it was time returned to the university for her last year of study, she looked and acted very much like a young woman destined to become the future executive. As the year progressed, Mary and Sarah, although very much dedicated to each other, found that they could not engage in a lesbian relationship. They had tried and found it unsatisfactory. They were normal heterosexual women and each agreed that it was best to seek a relationship that was satisfying to their needs. They had agreed that they would always be close friends, and no matter what happened they would always be there for each other. After graduation, Mary took a position with Honeybone in Phoenix as a human resource specialist. It was later that she discovered what that company had developed and could not help but be amused at the irony. Read Saga of Joe Bates by Anonymous and Sean Leah by Donna Allison. Sarah moved back home and took a position with her father's company. In less than 3 years she had proved herself so well that she had moved up to the position of Director of Marketing. It was because of this position that Sarah had her second encounter with Dr. Hendricks. After the repeal of the GRA laws, Dr. Hendricks had opened a research laboratory in nearby Charleston, West Virginia. At first Sarah did not know who was the head of this new company that was proposing that her firm manufacture a new line of microcatheters. When Dr. Hendricks walked into her office to submit his proposal, both Sarah and Hendricks were shocked when they came face to face with each other. For over an hour Sarah and her surgeon did little else than discuss how she had fared over the previous 4 years. Hendricks pointed out that he had promised to buy her a meal and had never had the opportunity to do so. Sarah canceled all her appointments for that afternoon and agreed to let Dr. Hendricks buy that long-awaited meal. 6 months later, Sarah became the bride of Dr. Charles Hendricks. Mary and Nancy were the maids of honor. Mary was quite obviously pregnant. When Sarah questioned her on the who and when of this miracle, all Mary would say with a sheepish grin was that she had made a stop in Dallas and had visited a certain depository. She would not say any more, but Sarah knew exactly where she had gone and for what. She had told Sarah that her fiancé was sterile and that he had agreed to this as an alternative. Sarah knew and felt even closer to Mary now, even if she would not admit the entire truth. As for Nancy, she married a handsome rancher who had wooed her while on a trip to visit Mary. Sarah had been amused by this. If anyone could herd cattle, it was Nancy. All in all, Sarah was pleased with the way things had turned out. Charles was a loving husband to her and a dedicated father to their 3 daughters. Although Sarah's secret never came to light among her friends and associates, Sarah was content. Acceptance was achieved.